Hi guys. Tonight, let's take a slow and honest walk into the heart of an ancient tradition you've probably heard of, but never really pictured in all its unsettling detail. Public baths. The steaming, echoing rooms where townsfolk gathered, secrets lingered in the mist, and the line between comfort and danger blurred in ways you might never expect. What if I told you these places were as much about quiet fear as about getting clean? So just settle in, and let's drift back to the beginning. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. Imagine a world where hot running water was a luxury for only the wealthiest, and for everyone else, the public bathhouse was more than just an occasional treat. It was a necessity. These were massive, echoing spaces, sometimes carved from marble, sometimes built from crumbling brick, often smelling of a mix of damp stone, burnt oil, and something faintly sweet but hard to place. They were alive with the sound of splashing water, hushed voices, and the occasional sharp command from a bath attendant. In ancient Rome, the bathhouse, called a thermae, was like a town square, buzzing with life from dawn until dusk. But for every visitor lost in the comfort of steam, there was another who kept a nervous eye on their belongings, and on the strangers who brushed past them, dripping and silent. The first thing you'd notice, stepping into a bathhouse, wasn't the warmth, but the eyes. People watched each other in subtle, unsettling ways. It wasn't just curiosity. There were rules here, and plenty of unspoken codes. How to wrap your towel, how to greet, where to look, how to avoid the gaze of certain regulars who claimed their corner of the pool. In some cities, there were stories of pickpockets working in pairs, silent as shadows, slipping through the steam and leaving behind only the faintest ripple in the water. If you were careless, your coin pouch might be gone before you reached the hot pool. But the thefts were just the surface. There were far deeper worries, ones that hid beneath the comfort. There was always a sense that something could go wrong. Someone might take offense at a careless glance, or a rumor might spread that would make you an outcast overnight. The social hierarchy of the baths was invisible but strict. The wealthy had their own private corners, and the poor made do with crowded, tepid pools. The attendants, the real power in the bathhouse, watched everything, eyes flicking from one group to another, quietly enforcing rules no one dared to break. The heat, too, could be deceptive. If you stayed too long, or if your heart was weak, the suffocating air would make your head spin, your vision blur. People collapsed sometimes, and the attendants would drag them out without a word, dumping them in the cool air outside to recover or not. The walls of the baths held stories, paintings of gods and heroes, yes, but also graffiti scratched by anonymous hands, warnings and boasts, secret messages between lovers or rivals. And the shadows in the corners always seemed to move a little, no matter how bright the lamps burned. For some, the greatest terror wasn't the threat of theft or violence, but the sense that you could be so utterly exposed, your body, your secrets, your reputation, all out in the open, in a world of stone and water that never quite let you forget you were being watched. For many, visiting the public baths was a ritual that brought both comfort and quiet anxiety. The routine was always the same. You'd slip off your sandals at the entrance, sometimes tucking them behind a column, or handing them to a boy who might, or might not, guard them for a coin. The air grew thicker as you moved deeper inside, the floor slick beneath your feet, and everywhere, the hum of voices echoing off stone. Every surface glistened with condensation, droplets running down the walls, collecting in little pools that no one bothered to clean. The first chamber, the apoditerium, was where you'd undress, sometimes in a flurry of nervous movement, sometimes slowly, eyes darting to see who was watching. Here, people whispered, old friends and rivals crossing paths, exchanging glances that could mean anything or nothing. Some men boasted about the business they'd done that day, others eyed each other with suspicion, the air thick with unspoken competition. In some cultures, women and men bathed separately, but in others, the lines blurred, and privacy was an afterthought. It wasn't unusual for rumors to swirl after a day at the baths. Who had spoken to whom? Who lingered in the warm pool just a bit too long with a stranger? After undressing, you'd make your way through a maze of chambers, frigidarium, tepidarium, caldarium, each with its own atmosphere. The frigidarium was cold and sharp, the kind of chill that made you gasp and shiver, your skin prickling as if it remembered every time you'd ever been afraid. The tepidarium was softer, the air gentle and forgiving, a place to pause and collect your thoughts, but still, you could never fully relax. There were always footsteps behind you, eyes flicking your way, conversations in languages you half understood. In the caldarium, the heat was overwhelming, so thick you could taste it, every breath sticky, your lungs struggling. Here, people sat shoulder to shoulder, sweat glistening on every back, and the steam rising in ghostly shapes. Sometimes, a stranger would strike up a conversation, their voice low and close, as if sharing a secret, but you could never tell if it was friendly or something else. There were stories, always stories, of lost rings slipping into the drains, of feuds settled with a single word whispered in the right ear, of jealous lovers making scenes that ended in tears. Some spoke of ghosts that haunted the oldest baths, shadows that slipped through the mist, glimpsed only for a moment before disappearing. Children would dare each other to go into the dark corners, always running out, breathless and wide-eyed, sure they'd felt a cold hand brush their arm. No one talked about these fears openly, but everyone felt them. The baths were supposed to be a place of cleansing, a place to forget your worries. Yet every time you stepped inside, you carried a quiet sense of dread, as if the walls themselves remembered every secret ever whispered, every shame that clung to the skin long after you'd dried off. But even in this dim world of shifting steam and whispers, there were small rituals meant to keep you safe, or at least give you a sense of control. Some bathers wore amulets tucked beneath their towels, little carved figures of gods or ancestors thought to ward off envy or the evil eye. Others whispered charms under their breath before stepping into the hottest pools, hoping the spirits that haunted the pipes and drains would leave them alone. The more superstitious insisted on splashing a bit of water over their left shoulder before undressing, a habit learned from someone older and, perhaps, a little wiser. The attendants, too, had their own customs, unspoken signals and silent warnings. If an attendant avoided a particular bench or stayed away from a certain alcove, the regulars noticed and did the same. No one ever asked why. Sometimes, a sudden hush would fall over the bath, a ripple of unease passing from group to group, as if everyone had heard a sound too faint to name. In those moments, people looked away, focused on their own thoughts, letting the silence settle until laughter or conversation gradually returned. The architecture itself seemed designed to amplify mystery. Narrow corridors twisted between chambers, sometimes leading to small, forgotten rooms that no one claimed. Some said these were for lovers. Others thought they were for secret meetings or punishments. The lamps burned low in these spaces, shadows stretching across the damp floor, and the air felt heavier, as if the walls pressed closer. In the largest baths, underground tunnels carried hot water from distant springs, and the rumbling could be felt through the stone, like a distant, steady heartbeat. Children claimed these tunnels were haunted, and on certain nights the grown-ups half believed them. More than one person had slipped and vanished down a hidden passage, their shouts muffled by the maze of stone. When a new visitor disappeared, the regulars would just shake their heads and mutter, they didn't know the rules. The rules were everything in the bathhouse. Some rules were written on the walls, chipped and faded in Latin or Greek. Warnings against running, reminders to pay the attendants, threats against thieves. But the most important rules were never written down. Don't stare too long at anyone. Don't take the best seat unless you've earned it. Don't ask questions about the old stains on the floor or the strange smells that sometimes drifted through the air. Most important of all, never stay past closing, even if the doors seem open and the lamps still burn. There were stories of people who lingered too late, who claimed to see figures moving in the steam after midnight, or heard voices speaking in the empty pools. In the morning, the attendants would find towels folded neatly, coins left on benches, but no sign of those who'd overstayed. The missing were rarely mentioned again, except in whispers, and only by those who remembered to be afraid. The baths offered comfort, but also 1,000 quiet threats, hidden in the ritual of getting clean. And so, as you sat beneath the dripping arches, letting the heat seep into your bones, you wondered what secrets the bathhouse would keep tonight, and which ones it might reveal, just for you. The truth was, no matter how many times you visited, the sense of unease never fully faded. There was always something unpredictable about the bathhouse, as if the space itself held a memory of every anxious glance and nervous laugh. You might sit quietly on the edge of the hot pool, letting the warmth wrap around your limbs, while behind you a new arrival scanned the room, unsure whether to trust the smiles and greetings that met them. Sometimes an argument would flare up, sharp and sudden, about nothing at all. Who took whose seat, who splashed too much, who owed whom a favor from some forgotten day. These disputes almost always ended with a nod, a quiet apology, and the careful restoration of peace. But underneath, tension simmered. The regulars all knew each other's names, or at least their habits, and a single misstep could shift your place in this fragile hierarchy. The quiet ones watched everything, rarely speaking, but missing nothing. The boisterous ones cracked jokes and filled the air with easy laughter, but even they kept an eye on the shadows. Children, bold in daylight, would grow silent as evening settled in, pressing closer to their parents, sensing some ancient warning they couldn't quite explain. In the women's baths, it was much the same. Gossip and laughter mingled with caution, alliances shifting in the steam, and every now and then, a story whispered about someone who had seen too much or said the wrong thing. Even the attendants, those invisible sentinels who swept the floors and stoked the fires, moved with a kind of wary grace. They were the keepers of the real secrets, which pipes rattled at night, which corners were safest, who could be trusted in a crisis. Sometimes, they would exchange glances across the room, silent messages passing between them in the language of the wary. You learned quickly to listen more than you spoke. The old-timers could tell you stories, if you caught them at the right moment. Stories of feuds that began over spilled water and ended with curses whispered behind closed doors. Of lovers who thought no one saw them slipping away, only to find their secrets scrawled in the graffiti by morning. Of sudden illnesses that struck the healthiest men and women, their faces turning pale as marble before the attendants dragged them out into the night air. Some claimed it was the heat, others blamed bad spirits. No one ever quite agreed. But everyone, in their own way, respected the boundaries the baths demanded. In this world, even the smallest mistake, a word out of place, a careless gesture, could echo for days. And so, you settled deeper into the water, feeling the pulse of the bathhouse all around you, wondering what stories would be born in the mist tonight, and which would simply disappear, never to be spoken of again. Nightfall always changed the mood inside the public baths. As dusk crept in through the high, narrow windows, the glow of lamps flickered on the damp stone walls, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. There was a hush that settled over the pools, a quieter, almost reverent silence, broken only by the gentle splash of water or a low murmur from a distant alcove. You noticed the change most in people's faces. Laughter faded to tight, thoughtful smiles, and eyes flicked warily toward the doors. Some regulars made a habit of leaving before dark, muttering about old superstitions or the cold air outside, but others lingered, drawn to the strange intimacy that twilight brought. The boundaries between strangers felt thinner here, with the world outside lost to darkness, and the inside world warm, wet, and fragrant with steam. But that comfort had its limits, and everyone felt it. Bath attendants moved more quietly at night, sweeping floors and checking lamps with the cautious care of people who had seen too much. They spoke in quick, clipped voices, sharing warnings in half sentences, careful not to disturb the delicate calm. Occasionally, someone new would ignore the unspoken curfew, daring to stretch out in the hottest pool or wander through the maze of chambers long after most had gone. The regulars would glance at each other, never saying a word, but everyone knew the risk. There were old tales that grew sharper after sunset, tales of strange shapes glimpsed in the steam, voices that echoed when no one was speaking, footsteps that didn't belong to any living soul. In every culture that built public baths, there were stories about what happened to those who overstayed. A missing towel, a pair of sandals never reclaimed, and an empty space in the water where someone had been only moments before. The next morning, no one mentioned the absence, but everyone noticed. Some said it was just fear playing tricks, a way for parents to scare children into obedience, but others claimed it was more something ancient that lived in the walls and water, watching and waiting. On cold nights, when the baths were most crowded, these legends felt real enough to make your skin prickle. You might catch a shiver from someone next to you, or see a bath attendant cross themselves, eyes darting to the darkest corners. There was comfort in the company of others, but also a sense that the bathhouse itself was alive, a creature with moods and secrets, whose favor you could never fully win. As you watched the lamps flicker and listened to the water's quiet song, you realized that even in a place built for cleansing, some shadows could never be washed away. Instead, you learned to live with them, letting their presence become part of the ritual, just as much as the warmth of the pool or the sound of distant laughter. The bathhouse, in all its quiet terror, was a world of its own, and you could only hope that tonight it would let you pass through untroubled. On the busiest days, the bathhouse felt like the center of the world. A swirling current of bodies and voices, steam rising in heavy clouds from the water, blending strangers into one shifting mass. Merchants and stonemasons, poets and soldiers, all found themselves stripped of rank and wealth, reduced to bare skin and borrowed towels. In theory, the baths were a place where everyone was equal. But in truth, even here, there were unspoken divisions. Some visitors slipped the attendants a little extra coin to have their water heated just right, or to reserve a coveted seat near the warmest corner. The poor, meanwhile, squeezed together on the cooler benches, making do with what space they could find. Yet for all the quiet competition, there was a sense of belonging that drew people back, day after day, year after year. The regulars became part of the place, faces you'd come to expect, with habits as familiar as the cracks in the tiles. There was the old man who told stories to anyone who'd listen, his laughter echoing off the stone. The mother who scolded her children in 3 languages, never letting them stray too far from her watchful eye. The young lovers who thought no one noticed their secret meetings in the shadowed alcoves, though everyone did. The rhythm of life in the baths was marked by little kindnesses, a stranger sharing a towel, someone offering a bite of bread, an attendant helping a child tie their sandals. Yet, behind every gesture lingered a sense of caution. You learned to count your coins before you left the water, to keep your towel close and your eyes open. Thefts were rarely spoken of, but everyone had lost something. Sandals, a favorite comb, sometimes a treasured ring slipped from a finger and never seen again. When you did discover something missing, there was nothing to do but accept it, mutter a curse, and move on. The baths were a place of letting go, not just of dirt, but of little losses and small grudges, washed away with the day's sweat and worry. Even as you relaxed into the warmth, you knew that the walls kept their own tally of what was given and taken. The stories of the bathhouse weren't written down. They lived in the sideways glances, the careful laughter, the quiet understanding that here, as everywhere, you could be seen or overlooked in ways that mattered. The water, ever shifting and never quite clear, was both a blessing and a warning, and every visit left, you changed in ways you'd only understand much later. In the flickering lamplight, the echoes inside the bathhouse could play tricks on your senses. Sometimes a laugh from the far end would bounce and swirl, making it sound as if someone was standing right beside you. Shadows slipped along the marble walls, and the steam would curl and cling, hiding faces, blurring gestures, lending the place an almost dreamlike feeling. You'd catch yourself glancing over your shoulder, unsure if that soft footstep was real or just your imagination. The attendants, always alert, seemed to glide from one chamber to the next, barely disturbing the quiet, but always noticing the smallest things: a dropped towel, an out-of-place sandal, a whispered word passed too quickly between bathers. They knew every regular by sight and could spot a newcomer within seconds. Some attendants were rumored to have secrets of their own, strange rituals they performed after closing, offerings to whatever ancient spirits lingered in the pipes and drains. No one dared question them, and the wisest bathers always treated them with respect, slipping them a little extra when the baths were emptiest. On certain nights, the baths would fill with a kind of restless energy. Maybe it was the wind howling outside, or the full moon shining through the high windows, but everyone felt it, a subtle tension that made even the friendliest faces look wary, and conversations grow more cautious. On those nights, Children were kept close, and the regulars exchanged uneasy glances. The old stories resurfaced. Tales of spirits that grew bold at night, of unlucky souls who vanished, their towels folded neatly on a bench, never to be seen again. Yet for all the fears, there was beauty in the ritual of the bath. The water's warmth, the gentle rhythm of voices, the smell of oil and wet stone, it all became a kind of lullaby, wrapping you in a fragile sense of peace. Here, you could let go of the world outside, if only for a little while, and become just another drifting shape in the mist. The bathhouse, with all its secrets and quiet terrors, was a place of paradox, comfort and anxiety, community and isolation, safety and risk, all swirling together in the steam. As you closed your eyes and let the heat soak into your skin, you wondered if, perhaps, that was the real reason people kept coming back. Not just to be clean, but to feel, even for a moment, that mysterious edge between fear and belonging, and to leave, for a time, their burdens behind in the shifting shadows of the bath. As days blurred into seasons, the bathhouse held its own calendar of rituals, marked by festivals and little changes that only regulars noticed. During certain holidays, the baths would be decorated with garlands of leaves or bundles of herbs, their sharp scents mingling with the ever-present warmth and dampness. On those days, crowds pressed even closer together, and the hum of conversation grew louder, filled with laughter, song, and the occasional heated debate. People brought small offerings to the gods, a handful of flowers, a scrap of colored cloth, a coin flicked into the water, hoping for good fortune, health, or simply a peaceful soak. But even amid the festive atmosphere, the sense of watchfulness never faded. You learned to keep your possessions hidden deep within your towel, or trusted to the least suspicious-looking attendant. Some bathers marked their sandals with secret scratches or tied charms around the straps, tiny tokens to help them identify what was theirs in the jumble at the door. Yet, every celebration was shadowed by the knowledge that too much merriment or a single careless word could spark trouble in an instant. Arguments flared quickly in the crowded pools, a drunken boast turning to a fight, an accidental splash becoming an insult. Sometimes, a bather would slip away after such a quarrel, only to return days later with a bruised face or a quieter voice. The stories grew with each retelling, shifting and growing until no one could remember the truth. In quieter moments, you'd notice how the steam softened the outlines of everything, the cracks in the marble, the scars on old men's arms, the lines of worry on women's faces. The baths offered a kind of forgiveness, a place where yesterday's burdens seemed to dissolve, even if only until the next visit. Still, some wounds ran deeper than the heat could reach. Grudges lingered in the corners, whispered in the rustle of towels and the splash of water. Some said you could tell a person's true nature by the way they moved through the bath, whether they offered space to a stranger, whether their laughter was generous or sharp, whether they met your gaze or looked away. Over time, you became attuned to the moods of the place, sensing when it was safe to linger and when it was better to leave early. A sudden silence, a door slamming too loudly, an attendant's warning glance. These were signs that not all was well, that something hidden might be stirring just beneath the surface. And so, even in the busiest hours, with sunlight slanting through clouded windows and voices rising in chorus, the bathhouse reminded you, no matter how bright the day, there were always shadows waiting in the steam, patient and silent, part of the ritual that kept the ancient walls standing year after year. There were moments in the bathhouse, In the brief lull between voices, or as a wave of steam rolled quietly across the pools, when you could almost forget the world outside entirely. The sensation was almost hypnotic, the warmth soaking through your muscles, the echoes of splashing water and quiet conversation mingling until they seemed to pulse in time with your heartbeat. Some bathers would close their eyes and simply float, surrendering themselves to the gentle rhythm of it all, letting the world fade to a blur of heat and softness. It was in these moments that the oldest regulars claimed to feel the presence of those who had bathed here before, generations of townsfolk, their worries and laughter still lingering in the stones. You might have heard, in passing, that each bathhouse had its guardian spirit, a presence more comforting than frightening, said to watch over the regulars and keep true disaster at bay. Attendants, especially the older ones, sometimes left a bowl of milk or a slice of bread in a shadowy corner before closing, just in case. These quiet offerings, made with a glance over the shoulder, were rarely discussed, but everyone noticed if they disappeared by morning. For most, the rituals were simple. Dip a hand in the cold pool before entering the hot. Circle the bath once before finding a place to sit. Avoid the cracked tile near the far wall. But every now and then, something would disrupt the calm. Maybe it was a visitor from another city, unfamiliar with the rhythms and unspoken rules, or a sudden chill in the air that set everyone on edge. Fights could break out in an instant. Quick, sharp exchanges of words, or even fists, broken up just as swiftly by attendants who moved with silent authority. And yet, there was a sense that all these disruptions were only surface ripples, quickly smoothed over by the deep, patient presence of the baths themselves. Even the regulars who remembered the worst arguments or the most dramatic scandals would shrug them off with a smile, as if to say, "The baths have seen it all before." Sometimes, in the heat of the caldarium, the air so thick it pressed against your chest, you'd wonder what it would be like to return in 100 years, to find the same stones, the same cracked marble benches, the same voices echoing through the steam. Would anything have changed? Or would the shadows and the light, the comfort and the unease, always remain? As night crept in and the last few bathers gathered their towels, you watched the attendants move from room to room, checking each corner, locking each door with a deliberate, careful motion. You realized then how much trust it took, day after day, to step into this world, to strip away every protection and enter the water not knowing what you might lose, or what, in some small way, you might find. There was an old saying among the regulars, shared in whispers between friends or with a wry smile over the rim of a wooden cup, that if you truly listened, the bathhouse would teach you all the secrets of the town. They didn't mean gossip, though there was plenty of that. It was the way people revealed themselves in small, telling gestures. The way a merchant washed his hands before anything else. The way an apprentice lingered in the cold pool. The subtle nods exchanged by rivals, always wary, always polite. The baths were where alliances were made, feuds quietly negotiated, and sometimes where someone's true nature was glimpsed for the first time. This was a world where reputation could shift as quickly as the steam, and a single careless moment might be discussed for weeks. Even the attendants became skilled observers, learning to sense the hidden tensions, stepping in to soothe tempers or distract a crowd before things turned ugly. In quieter hours, you might find yourself sitting shoulder to shoulder with someone you'd never meet outside, An old soldier with scars fading into pale lines, a baker with flour still dusting his hair, a widow with a laugh that echoed through the pools. In these moments, the line between comfort and danger felt thin as mist. Some regulars believed the baths held the power to both heal and haunt. They'd say that soaking in the hot water could ease pains that nothing else would touch, but if you brought anger or fear inside, you might leave with a shadow clinging to your heart. No one could say exactly when these beliefs began, but every town had stories. A merchant who recovered from an illness after a month of bathing, a traveler who grew more anxious with each visit, leaving one day and never returning. You might see, on certain mornings, a woman quietly washing the threshold with herbs, or an old man muttering prayers before stepping into the pool. Rituals, passed down from mothers to daughters, fathers to sons, as much a part of the bath as the stone benches or steaming water. But perhaps the most important lessons were learned by simply watching, day after day, as the same faces moved through the rooms, leaving their worries behind for a little while. There was comfort in the routine, a sense that the world outside, its noise, its danger, its unpredictability, could be left at the door. And yet, every visitor knew, deep down, that the walls of the bathhouse kept their own kind of memory. Some secrets would always stay hidden in the shadows, floating just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to drift up into the light. On the coldest mornings, steam would billow out from the bathhouse doors, curling like smoke into the chilly dawn, drawing townsfolk in before they'd even wiped the sleep from their eyes. The streets might be silent, dusted with frost, or echoing with the distant calls of merchants setting up stalls, but inside the baths, warmth wrapped around you like an old friend. You could almost forget the hard stone beneath your feet, or the aches in your shoulders as you watched the water swirling, reflecting the flickering lamplight on the ceiling overhead. Some days, the world outside felt impossibly far away, as if the thick air and muffled sounds created a cocoon around the bathers, holding time at bay. It was during these early hours that the bathhouse revealed its softest side. The regulars nodded to one another, exchanging greetings in voices too gentle to disturb the peace, and even the most excitable children seemed to sense the need for quiet. A baker might share a warm roll, an old woman might help untangle a child's hair, and for a moment, all divisions faded. Still, even in this calm, the rules held firm. Everyone knew to move slowly on the slippery tiles, to keep the hot water from splashing onto bare skin, to offer space to the elders who arrived shivering and stiff. The attendants, bleary-eyed but ever vigilant, watched from the edges, ready to settle disputes or refill the oil lamps as needed. Even laughter was softer here, like a secret passed from mouth to ear, yet the tranquility had a fragile edge. If someone entered with too much noise, if a stranger disregarded the etiquette, the spell could break in an instant. It was not uncommon for a single raised voice to bring the whole room to a hush, as everyone turned to see what had upset the balance. Sometimes it was nothing. A misunderstanding quickly soothed, a dropped towel quietly returned, but other times, it was as if the bathhouse itself bristled at the disruption, the air growing heavier, the steam thickening, until even old friends felt uneasy. Some said this was the will of the spirits who watched over the place. Others simply blamed the nerves that came with being so exposed among so many strangers. Either way, a kind of delicate peace always returned, though it might take a while for the smiles and easy conversation to flow again. It was on these mornings, as the first rays of sunlight broke through clouded windows, that you realized how much the baths meant to the town, not just as a place to be cleansed, but as a fragile refuge, a place where, for a little while, you could simply exist, wrapped in warmth, letting the dangers and uncertainties of the world drift far, far away. As days stretched toward evening, the rhythm inside the bathhouse changed again, shaped by the steady flow of arrivals and departures. In the late afternoons, when the sun cast golden light through high windows and painted shifting patterns on the steamy floors, the pools would grow crowded with a different mix of faces: tired merchants, gossiping neighbors, dusty travelers shaking off the road. The air was thick with the scents of oil and damp linen, the echoes of laughter and soft arguments, the slap of wet feet against stone. This was when news of the day was passed along: who had quarreled at the market, which family had lost a chicken, whose daughter was said to be meeting a suitor in secret. The baths, for all their rituals, were also a place where stories grew and changed, sometimes swelling into rumor, sometimes fading back into the mist. In the center pool, children played, their shrieks quickly shushed by mothers wary of drawing too much attention. The youngest bathers clung to the edges, eyes wide with excitement and a little fear, soaking up the atmosphere and learning, day by day, the silent rules of the place. Some adults drifted to the quieter corners, seeking a moment's peace before returning to noisy households or late work. They'd close their eyes, letting the warmth soothe their aches, the distant voices becoming a lullaby that promised a brief escape. Every so often someone would slip out a side door, their departure marked by the quiet jingle of coins or the click of a latch. The attendants noticed all of it, marking time not with clocks, but with the shifting moods of the bathers and the steady dimming of the lamps. For a newcomer, it was easy to feel lost, unsure when to speak, when to move, how long to linger in each pool. But regulars offered subtle guidance, a nod, a gesture, a shared smile, welcoming those who respected the unspoken rhythm. In these hours, the bathhouse became a living memory of the town, its walls absorbing every joy and sorrow, every whispered hope and passing fear. As twilight approached and the first stars blinked into view outside, the sense of connection deepened. Old arguments were set aside for a time, and even the most reserved faces relaxed, if only for a moment, in the shared warmth. Here, surrounded by steam and story, it was possible to imagine a world where troubles faded like footprints in water, and where, if you listened closely, you might hear the quiet heartbeat of the bathhouse itself, steady and patient, promising a kind of safety found nowhere else. There was a quiet understanding that the bathhouse did not belong to any one person, but to everyone, and no one at the same time. It was older than most of its visitors, older than the attendants who swept its floors or lit its lamps, and perhaps even older than the town that had grown around it. Some said it had always been there, its foundations laid atop sacred springs or beneath ancient stones that still whispered in the heat. Whether those stories were true hardly mattered. What mattered was the feeling you got as you stepped through its doors, the sense that you were entering a place outside of time, where the world slowed and softened, and where things long forgotten could rise again through the steam. In one corner, you might hear a song half sung by an old man who claimed he learned it from his grandfather, who had learned it from his. The melody would twist through the air, carried by the warmth, and for a moment, the bathhouse would seem to listen too. In another chamber, a young woman might be braiding her sister's hair, their laughter echoing through the marble room as if it had been there forever. It was these simple human moments that gave the place its strange power. But behind them, always, was something deeper. A weight that lived in the walls, in the way the air shifted suddenly when you passed certain doorways, or the way your reflection in the water sometimes seemed slower to move than you were. The more time you spent there, the more you noticed. A crack in a tile that hadn't been there yesterday. A smell you couldn't quite name, faint and fleeting. A flicker of movement behind the curtain of steam, gone when you looked directly. You might try to explain it away. Old building, tricks of the light, too much heat. But part of you would remember. And the next time you entered, you'd pause just a little longer at the threshold, listening, watching, wondering. Some regulars spoke of dreams that came only after a visit to the bathhouse. Strange, vivid images of water running uphill, of voices speaking in forgotten tongues, of doors opening onto places that didn't exist. They'd wake up uneasy, clutching their blankets, hearts racing, the scent of steam still clinging to their skin. Others swore they'd never had more peaceful sleep than after a long soak, as if the water had washed not just their bodies, but their fears and regrets as well. Both kinds of stories were true, in their own way. The bathhouse gave you what you brought to it, some said. If you entered in peace, it would cradle you in warmth. If you came with anger, it would echo it back. And if you came seeking something, answers, forgiveness, escape, it might offer those things, but never without a cost. Among the regulars, there were those who claimed the bathhouse changed slightly from day to day, not just in mood or lighting, but in its very shape. A hallway that seemed short yesterday might stretch longer today. A doorway that led to the cold pool might now open into a silent chamber lit by a single flickering lamp. Most dismissed these claims with a shrug or a chuckle, blaming fatigue or poor memory. But every now and then, a newcomer would wander through the wrong door and return with a pale face, unsure how to describe what they'd seen. Some said they'd found themselves alone in an empty room where the air felt colder, where the steam did not move, and where their own footsteps seemed too loud. Others spoke of hearing voices that weren't part of any conversation, whispers that faded before meaning could form. These tales were never told too loudly. The bathhouse, after all, was a place of respect. Yet they lingered, repeated in hushed tones in the changing rooms or murmured while drying off beneath the tall stone arches. The attendants, if asked directly, would simply smile and shake their heads, offering no answers. But the sharp-eyed visitor would notice how those same attendants avoided certain hallways late in the evening, how they never lingered near the oldest section of the baths after sunset. There was one bench near the deep pool where no one ever sat. It wasn't marked, wasn't roped off or claimed. It simply remained empty, no matter how crowded the baths became. Those who tried to rest there never stayed long. Something about the angle of the light, the echo of sound, made it feel wrong. Over time, the regulars stopped questioning it. Just as they learned to avoid speaking certain names too close to the steam vents, or to step carefully past the cracked mosaic near the third alcove, as if the floor itself might remember. These habits weren't written down, but passed from bather to bather, absorbed through repetition, until they became part of the ritual. And yet, despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, the bathhouse remained beloved. People came not only to wash, but to be washed clean of more than sweat and dust. They came to feel held, seen, and strangely protected, even if they never admitted how often they glanced behind themselves as they walked from chamber to chamber. The silence of the place, so peaceful at first, held layers the longer you listened. It wasn't an emptiness, but a fullness, like the breath held between questions, or the pause before someone speaks a truth. And deep inside, under the stone and heat, the bathhouse waited, patient and listening, as it had always done. There was something almost sacred about the silence that settled over the bathhouse in the final hour before closing. The crowds had thinned, the air had cooled just slightly, and only a few bathers remained, moving slowly and deliberately, as if reluctant to leave. Lamps burned lower now, their golden glow softened by the ever-present steam, and even the attendants moved more gently, speaking only when necessary. It was during this time that the bathhouse felt most alive, not bustling, not loud, but aware. Every creak of wood, every drop of water from the ceiling seemed to land with more meaning, like punctuation in a whispered sentence. Some called it the hour of memory, when the walls themselves seemed to exhale, releasing fragments of the day back into the water. Those who bathed during this time often left more slowly, walking with heads bowed, eyes thoughtful. The warmth lingered on their skin, but so did something else, an echo, a weight, difficult to name. The bathhouse had seen love and grief, betrayal and forgiveness, all within these chambers, and in these quiet minutes, those feelings seemed to stir again, just beneath the surface. There were those who came only at this hour, drawn by the stillness, by the chance to hear what others missed. They'd say that if you listened closely, you could hear old conversations replayed softly in the mist, not as voices, but as impressions, a sense of words once spoken. A smile from a woman long gone, a sigh from a man who once waited by the far column, a child's laughter like bubbles rising from the bottom of the pool. Whether imagined or real, no one knew for sure, but those who felt it didn't question. They simply soaked a little longer, letting the memories brush past like ripples. Sometimes, an attendant would pause in the doorway, staring into the room with an unreadable expression, as if trying to remember something important, or waiting for something to appear. Then, they would move on, quietly, without a word. The stone floors, slick and worn from years of bare feet, seemed to hum in this hour, carrying a deep vibration that you felt more than heard. The bathhouse never rushed you, but it never let you forget either. Even as the last lamp was extinguished and the great door creaked slowly closed, it kept your name, your steps, your warmth. And when you returned, it would remember. Rainy days brought their own rhythm to the bathhouse. Outside, the streets turned slick with mud, and people hunched beneath cloaks and shawls as they hurried through the storm, but within those ancient walls, the air remained warm and thick, the stone floor steaming as droplets hissed and vanished beneath wet feet. The baths were always busier on days like these, when the cold and damp crept into bones, and the only true refuge was found in heat and ritual. There was something comforting about arriving with rain still clinging to your skin and stepping into that clouded world of warmth and shadow where the storm outside became a distant memory. Bathers moved slowly, more contemplative on days like this, Their voices hushed, their gestures softened. You could hear the soft patter of water striking the roof, a sound that blended with the splash of the pools and the quiet rustle of towels being wrung out. The bathhouse seemed to sigh beneath the weight of the weather, its old stones holding fast against the wind, the fire in the hypocaust burning just a little brighter to drive out the chill. Attendants worked with sleeves damp and sandals squeaking faintly as they moved from chamber to chamber, lighting extra lamps, adjusting the flow of warm water, making space for the extra guests who arrived shivering, faces pink from the cold. On these days, even the regulars lingered longer, soaking deep into the evening, eyes half closed, as if trying to press every ounce of warmth into their skin before they had to face the outside world again. There was camaraderie in that shared escape. Strangers exchanged nods, sometimes even quiet smiles, bound not by friendship, but by the mutual need to feel human again. In the hottest pools, steam rose thick and slow, swirling like smoke, hiding all but the faintest outlines of those within. It was easy to forget names, faces, time. You became part of the breath of the place, another shape in the mist. And yet, for all the comfort, the old rules held true. Don't stay too long. Don't speak too loudly. Don't ask questions about what you might see in the reflection of the water, especially when it ripples without being touched. The storm outside seemed to awaken something ancient in the walls, something not cruel, but watchful. Regulars would say that storms made the bathhouse listen harder, that the rain opened doors not usually felt, and those who stayed too late might find themselves stepping into a hallway that wasn't there yesterday. A few even claimed to have seen flashes of light from deep within the tunnels beneath the floor, places no one dared explore, and still the baths remained full. Because the need to be warm, to be clean, to feel safe in a world full of cold rain and sharp wind, those needs ran deeper than fear. And the bathhouse, for all its mysteries, gave you what you needed. If you paid attention, if you followed the rules, if you knew when to leave, the bathhouse at dusk carried a beauty all its own, wrapped in gold and shadow, a world suspended between day and night. The last of the natural light filtered in through high slits in the stone walls, painting the rising steam with long, honey-colored beams that made the air shimmer like spun silk. In this hour, voices softened even further, laughter became more subdued, and the atmosphere leaned towards something more meditative, almost sacred. Those who stayed until this time were not in a hurry. They had learned to savor each moment. The slow unfolding of warmth in their muscles, the quiet thrum beneath their skin, the way the world narrowed down to simple sensations: heat, breath, silence, water. Here, time itself felt different. A minute could stretch on like an entire afternoon, or pass in the blink of an eye. Some bathers closed their eyes and sat perfectly still for what felt like hours, only to open them and find the room almost unchanged, the same steam curling around the same unmoving figures. In the tepidarium, the middle chamber, where the water was neither cold nor hot, just comfortably warm, you often found the most stillness. This was the chamber for thinking, for remembering, for letting go. Some people brought small items with them, tokens of memory or prayer, hidden beneath folds of linen or slipped into a shoe. A ring that no longer fit, A carved bead from a grandmother's necklace, a smooth stone picked up on a walk years ago. These objects were sometimes left in cracks in the walls, tucked behind benches, offered to the unseen. Attendants knew not to touch them. No one ever spoke of them, but everyone noticed when a new one appeared. This silent offering gave the place a kind of reverence, as though it were not just a bathhouse, but a shrine. You did not have to believe in anything specific to feel it. The walls were thick with presence. They held not only heat, but emotion, grief soaked into stone, joy caught in the corners of ceiling arches, longing pressed into the spaces between tiles. On some evenings, it felt as though all of that collective human experience might rise up at once and speak, not with words, but with pressure and scent and sound. A breeze might pass through where there was no window. A splash might echo when no one had moved. And still, it was never frightening, only humbling, as though the building reminded you, you are not the first to carry these burdens, to seek peace here, to cry into the steam. You will not be the last. The bathhouse had welcomed kings and beggars, warriors and midwives, children and the dying. It made no distinctions. All were bare in the water. All were softened by the heat. All left something behind, whether they meant to or not. And in return, they took with them a trace of the bath's deep, ancient silence, a silence that lived in the bones long after the skin had dried. Some believed that the bathhouse had a memory stronger than any person, that the walls not only absorbed the voices and footsteps of those who passed through, but held on to them, whispering their essence back into the steam over time. They said that if you sat long enough in the caldarium, the hottest room, with air so thick it pressed down like a warm hand, you might begin to feel emotions not your own. A sense of sudden sorrow when no thought had caused it. A wave of nostalgia for a moment you never lived. A quiet joy that crept into your chest without reason. These weren't just moods. They were impressions, echoes of lives that had soaked into the stone for generations. And in some rare moments, when the bathhouse was nearly empty and the lamps burned low, you might even hear a name whispered from a corner where no one stood. The attendants said nothing, of course. They merely swept the floors and stoked the coals, their eyes betraying no reaction when questioned. But every one of them, even the youngest, avoided cleaning certain alcoves after dark, or paused briefly before opening specific doors. Their movements were learned, practiced, passed down not through formal training, but through watching and knowing. They learned which taps groaned like voices, which tiles always felt colder than the rest, which benches never quite dried no matter how warm the air became. The regular bathers learned too, though they never discussed it. They simply followed the rhythm. Ritual was comfort. Repetition was safety. Enter through the left corridor. Sit only after pouring water over your feet. Don't look too long into the central pool's reflection after dusk. No one could explain why, but everyone agreed. These small acts, respected over time, preserved the delicate balance that made the bathhouse feel not only warm, but alive. On especially foggy nights, when the streets outside vanished in a blur of mist and the bathhouse became the only solid place left in the world, something even older seemed to stir. You might notice the lamps flicker in sequence, as if responding to footsteps that couldn't be heard. You might see a ripple in the water, though no one had moved. And sometimes, just as you were leaving, wrapping yourself in a towel still heavy with heat, you might glimpse a figure in the far chamber, still as stone, gazing back. You would look again, and it would be gone. Or perhaps it had never been there, but the feeling would stay with you, the weight of unseen eyes, not malevolent, but present, watching, waiting, not judging, only remembering. You wouldn't speak of it, no one did, but you would come back, because even with the mystery, or perhaps because of it, the bathhouse gave you something rare, a moment to be stripped, not just of clothing, but of everything heavy and sharp. In that quiet heat, you were allowed to disappear a little, to become one more breath among thousands, carried through time on steam that never stopped rising. There were those who swore that the bathhouse knew when you needed it most. Not just on days when your back ached or your hands were stiff from work, but on the quiet days, when sorrow clung to your ribs, when sleep had refused to come, when you carried something heavy in your chest and didn't yet have the words for it. On those days, the warmth seemed deeper, the water gentler, the silence kinder. You'd step inside and feel the tension loosen in places you hadn't realized were tight, as though the very air reached into you and began to untangle the knots. No one would ask what was wrong. The other bathers might nod to you, might shift slightly to make space, but no words were needed. The bathhouse taught stillness. It taught presence. And somehow, without ever speaking, it let you know you weren't alone. You'd see it in the way someone poured a little water over your shoulders as they passed, or how an attendant handed you a warmer towel than usual, or how a stranger offered half a fig from a pocket with nothing more than a glance. There was a kindness here that didn't need language, one that had been shaped over centuries and steeped into the very stone. And yet, beneath that kindness, the mysteries remained. The deeper you let yourself sink into the bathhouse's rhythm, the more you began to notice its patterns. How certain doors always stayed slightly ajar, how a breeze might brush past when none should exist, how the lamps in the oldest chamber flickered in a way that didn't quite match the draft. You stopped trying to explain it. You simply accepted it, the way one accepts that water is wet or fire burns. Some visitors returned, not for the heat or the healing, but for the silence between those flickers, the soft hum of something greater. They called it a presence. Not a ghost, not a god, just something that had always been there, and would be there long after the last stone cooled. Some left offerings in secret, coins pressed into cracks, dried flowers wrapped in cloth, scraps of parchment with words written in trembling hands. These were tucked away with reverence, never touched, only noticed. A few claimed their wishes had been answered. A few said nothing changed. All returned. The bathhouse didn't promise miracles. It offered space. And sometimes that was enough. On the coldest nights, when frost etched patterns on the windows, and the outside world felt too loud, too sharp, too much, you could slip into the baths and feel the weight shift. Just slightly. Not gone, but lighter, shared. Carried by the steam, lifted by the hush of 100 other heartbeats that had passed through before you. And when you finally left, wrapping yourself in a towel and stepping barefoot onto the stone floor, you might pause at the threshold and glance back, not to check for something forgotten, but to acknowledge the silence, to nod once to the warmth, as if saying thank you to something that had no name but had still listened. It was often said, though rarely allowed, that the bathhouse had its own kind of seasons, not measured by the calendar, but by feeling. There were weeks when everything felt brighter, when the steam seemed to glow and laughter came easier, when even the oldest stones radiated calm. These were the light seasons, marked by weddings, safe returns from long journeys, births celebrated in the whisper of proud grandparents in the tepidarium. The bathhouse absorbed these joys gently, like a sponge soaking in warmth, and reflected them back in small ways, in the way the water flowed more smoothly, in how the lamps burned a little longer before flickering out, in how the quiet seemed peaceful rather than heavy. But there were other times, too, darker seasons, when the silence inside felt thick and strained, when voices dropped low and glances lingered too long. Illness sweeping through the town, an accident at the mill, the death of someone well known. These things left invisible fingerprints on the bathhouse. The steam clung closer to the skin. The attendants spoke less. The regulars followed their rituals with more care, as if not to draw the attention of something hovering just beyond the mist. It wasn't superstition, not entirely. It was respect, a recognition that even places built for cleansing could carry weight, and that some days required gentler hands and quieter movements. The bathers felt it. They'd arrive more slowly, stay for shorter periods, avoid the back corners. The jokes would fade, replaced by long silences, filled only by the sound of dripping water and the occasional sigh. In these times, you might notice more offerings left in the cracks of the stone. A pressed flower, a carved wooden charm, a piece of cloth tied to a pipe. These tokens multiplied during the darker seasons, as if people were reaching not for solutions, but for presence, for reassurance that someone, something, was still listening. The bathhouse did not change physically during these cycles, but to those who knew it well, everything felt different. Even the temperature seemed to shift slightly. The hot rooms not quite as hot, the cold pools more biting than usual. Some said this was just perception, but others weren't so sure. Children, ever sensitive to mood, grew quieter during such days. They clung to parents, whispered to each other, sometimes refusing to go near certain chambers altogether. And though the attendants never acknowledged it, they moved faster through the rooms, lighting extra lamps and muttering prayers beneath their breath when they thought no one heard. Yet through it all, the bathhouse endured. It had seen centuries of these seasons come and go, had absorbed generations of laughter and mourning, and continued to open its doors each day with the same slow creak. It did not promise to heal the world outside, but it offered a space to hold what could not be held anywhere else. A shared space, rich with unspoken understanding, where even the heaviest sorrows could be set down for a moment to rest in the steam and warmth until their shape softened enough to carry again. There were stories, quiet ones passed between the oldest bathers, usually shared in soft voices during the final minutes before the last lamp was extinguished, about people who had entered the bathhouse not to be healed, but to disappear. Not in the literal sense, though even those tales existed, whispered by those who swore someone they knew had walked into the mist of the caldarium one evening and was simply never seen again. No, these stories were subtler. They spoke of those who arrived burdened by something unspoken, who moved through the chambers like shadows, saying little, watching everything. Over the course of weeks, or sometimes months, their presence would become a fixture. A man who always chose the same bench in the frigidarium, a woman who sat alone at the edge of the middle pool, never entering the water, only listening. Then, one day they would stop coming. No announcement, no farewell, just absence. And it was the way they left, that lingered in people's minds. You might glance at their usual seat and feel a sudden, inexplicable cold. You might pass by the corner where they once stood and notice a strange silence, heavier than before. Regulars came to believe that the bathhouse absorbed not only presence but departure, that it remembered those who needed to be forgotten and folded them gently into its walls. These tales were not sad exactly. They carried a kind of reverence, as if the bathhouse had offered something no other place could, not escape, but transformation, a chance to become someone or something else. Even the attendants, when pressed, would sometimes nod slowly, their eyes distant, as if recalling a name they hadn't spoken in years. "Yes," they'd say, "I remember him. Quiet. Always stayed near the fourth column. Then, one day, gone. And that was all." The bathhouse, after all, was a place for letting go, for shedding layers, not just of dirt or sweat, but of story, identity, fear. In the warm mist, under the flicker of oil lamps, names could be left behind, grief could be released, and silence could become a kind of rebirth. There were those who came for exactly that. They never said it aloud, but you could see it in the way they sat, perfectly still, eyes closed, as if listening for something deeper than the sound of dripping water. And sometimes, just before leaving, they would pause in the threshold, their hand pressed gently against the stone wall, as if in farewell. The regulars never asked questions. They simply nodded, recognizing something wordless in the gesture. The bathhouse never spoke of those it had kept, but if you listened closely on certain nights, when the steam rose high and the windows fogged over, you might hear a second set of footsteps behind you, just for a moment, then gone. And if you did, you didn't run, you didn't turn around. You simply placed your towel a little more carefully on the bench, lowered yourself into the water, and let the warmth fold over you like memory. Because the bathhouse did not forget, and in its remembering, it offered peace, not always joyful, not always light, but deep, enduring, and complete. In one of the oldest corners of the bathhouse, beneath a stone arch, carved with faded patterns no one could quite decipher, there stood a narrow wooden door that didn't seem to lead anywhere. It was never open. No attendants ever passed through it. No water was heard behind it. No drafts slipped out beneath its base. It simply stood there, slightly warped with age, its handle smooth from the touch of countless hands who had reached for it, then thought better. Everyone knew about the door, though few spoke of it directly. Children would dare one another to touch it, to knock once and run, their laughter echoing too loudly through the steam. But no one ever opened it. And those who lingered too close to it often returned with strange dreams. Restless sleep full of deep water, voices speaking without mouths, halls that twisted and turned endlessly, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Some said the door had once been an entrance to a private chamber for a noble long forgotten. Others claimed it was nothing at all, just a remnant of a past renovation, sealed off and useless. But there were those, the oldest bathers, who never sat near it, not even when the bathhouse was full. They claimed, gently and without fear, that the door wasn't meant to be opened, that it wasn't locked to keep people out, but to keep something else in. Whether or not you believed such stories, you noticed how the air near the door always felt just a little cooler, how the stones nearby stayed damp even after hours of heat, and how even the flickering lamps seemed to avoid casting their full glow in that direction. No one had ever seen an attendant clean near it, and when asked, they would only shake their head and change the subject. The presence of the door became part of the bathhouse's rhythm, like the sound of dripping water or the creak of the old wooden benches. It was simply there, unopened, unmoving, unchanging. A quiet reminder that not every space in the bathhouse was meant to be entered. It gave the bathers a sense of boundary, of reverence. The rest of the rooms, for all their steam and shadow, welcomed you. They shifted with your presence, embraced you in heat and quiet. But the door did not. It remained apart. And perhaps, in some way, that made the rest of the bathhouse feel safer. As though whatever lay behind it chose to stay there, observing the rituals of the living, never intruding, never forgotten. On certain nights, when the wind outside was high and the bathhouse was almost empty, someone might claim to have heard a sound from behind the door. Not knocking, not voices, just a low, slow breath, like the exhale of something ancient and dreaming. No one ever confirmed it, and no one ever stayed long enough to listen twice. But still, each day, the bathhouse opened its main doors with the same quiet welcome. The fire was stoked, the pools were filled, the attendants nodded, and life went on. The door remained closed, and the bathers, as they moved through the warmth and the ritual, accepted that not all mysteries needed answers, and that sometimes the greatest kindness a place can offer is the silence of what it chooses not to reveal. There was a ritual known only to a handful of the most devoted bathhouse visitors, one never written down, never formally taught, but passed quietly from one person to another in the kind of knowing look that lingered just a second longer than necessary. It wasn't a secret ceremony or a forbidden practice, but rather a slow, deliberate way of moving through the bathhouse, one chamber at a time, one breath at a time, as if retracing the steps of all those who had come before. It began at the threshold, not with crossing it, but with standing still, bare feet on cool stone, eyes closed, listening, not just to the sound of water, but to the tone of the air, the weight of the silence. Those who followed this ritual believed the bathhouse had moods, and it was important to greet it gently, to acknowledge its presence before stepping inside. Only then would you pass into the first chamber, the dressing room, and remove your clothes with care, folding each piece as if storing part of yourself away. Then, barefoot and wrapped in nothing but a towel, you'd enter the frigidarium, letting the cold bite into your skin, reminding you that the body was real and present and alive. You'd pause there, not long, just long enough to feel your breath slow and your senses sharpen. From there, the ritual would guide you to the tepidarium, the warm middle space where the air hugged you close and the stone seats radiated comfort. This was the place of reflection. People sat in silence here, their eyes half-lidded, their hands resting on knees or folded gently in laps. No one spoke. The room seemed to ask for quiet. And if you listened carefully, you might begin to feel the presence of those who had sat there before you, their thoughts not as words, but as warmth left behind, impressions in the air like perfume clinging to fabric. After this came the caldarium, the hottest room, where the steam rose thick and heavy and the air shimmered with heat. Here, you would sit until sweat covered every inch of skin, until your heartbeat slowed to match the pulse of the room. This was the space for release, grief, fear, memory, all softened in the heat, rose with the steam, and drifted up into the vaulted ceiling where shadows flickered like wings. Some said this was the place where the bathhouse truly lived, where it reached out and accepted what you could no longer carry. And when you left, stepping carefully back through each chamber, you did not speak, you did not rush. You let your body cool slowly, your thoughts settle like sediment in still water. You dressed again with care, your clothing now a new skin, and only when you stepped back onto the threshold did you exhale fully. It wasn't a prayer, but it felt close. This ritual was not for everyone. Many bathers came and went without ever knowing it existed, but those who followed it returned again and again, not seeking answers, but seeking the quiet acceptance it offered. The sense that in a world too loud and fast, there was still one place that understood the need to move slowly, to feel deeply, and to leave without needing to explain what had been left behind. The bathhouse had its own way of marking time, and it had nothing to do with clocks or bells. It marked time by the sounds and silences, by the shifting weight of footsteps, by the way the steam clung differently to the walls depending on the hour. Morning steam was light, lifting quickly toward the ceiling, full of movement and quiet energy. By noon, it hung lower, thicker, filled with the scent of oils and skin, buzzing faintly with conversation. But in the late hours, the steam grew heavy and slow, pressing close to the skin like a hand laid gently on the shoulder. This was when the bathhouse remembered the most, or at least, that's what the regulars believed. They said you could learn to read the day by how the heat moved through the rooms. Some claimed that on certain days, anniversaries of old tragedies, or dates no longer written on any calendar, the temperature would shift unexpectedly, and the steam would grow eerily still. These weren't days to linger. Even the bravest bathers would come only to wash quickly and leave, and the attendants lit extra lamps without being asked. But on most days, the rhythm remained steady. You could tell who would arrive by the sound of their walk, the merchant's quick shuffle, always in a hurry, the widow's deliberate steps, tapping softly with her cane, the twins who always raced each other to the warmest bench, their laughter echoing through the arches like birdsong. The bathhouse held them all, absorbing their patterns into its own pulse, welcoming their stories with the same quiet grace, and it held absences just as firmly. When someone failed to arrive at their usual time, the space they left behind felt tangible. You noticed the way a bench remained dry, or how a particular tile stayed cool. No one mentioned it, but everyone felt it. Some returns were met with warm smiles and small nods, silent acknowledgments of a journey survived. Others returned quieter than before, their presence thinner, as if some part of them had not come back at all. The bathhouse accepted them just the same. It did not ask questions. It simply offered warmth, silence, and time. Attendants moved through this world like quiet stewards of something sacred. They knew every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the ancient pipes. They spoke little, but when they did, it was with precision. A glance could mean, "Don't sit there today." A gesture could guide a lost visitor away from a room best left alone. Newcomers often mistook their silence for indifference, but the regulars understood. The attendants listened with their whole bodies. They could sense when someone needed solitude, when tension lingered in the air, when joy needed space to expand. In this way, the bathhouse lived, not just as a place of water and heat, but as a vessel for stories that didn't need words. It remembered through presence, through stillness, through the steady rhythm of lives passing through. And if you stayed long enough, if you returned often enough, you might feel that rhythm settle into your bones. You might find that, even on days when your heart felt heavy or your mind scattered, the bathhouse held you in its quiet way, reminding you that time here did not rush, did not push, did not demand. It simply was. And that was enough. There was a belief, passed along more like a superstition than a rule, that the bathhouse always gave something back. It wasn't always what you expected, and it certainly wasn't always immediate. But something exchanged hands, or spirits, between the visitor and the space itself. Some received clarity, the kind that settled into the mind after a long soak and surfaced days later, in the quiet moment before sleep. Others found relief from pains they hadn't even realized they'd been carrying, until they stood up and discovered that some part of their body no longer ached. But what the bathhouse gave was not always soft. Occasionally, it returned memories long buried, sharp as a stone beneath your foot, or emotions you thought long dried up, suddenly blooming in your chest with unbearable color. There were bathers who emerged from the steam in tears, unable to explain why, and those who laughed louder than they had in years without a single reason. The bathhouse, it seemed, knew where the weight lay and chose how to lift it, or shift it, or simply show it to you in the reflection of the water. This was why some people only visited once. They came expecting a simple wash, a break from the cold, and instead were handed a piece of themselves they hadn't asked to see. They did not return. Others came again and again, drawn to that unknowable honesty, that wordless dialogue between soul and stone. For them, the bathhouse became a kind of mirror, fogged and flickering, yes, but truer than most. The attendants, as always, said nothing, but they saw everything. They noticed when someone's shoulders slowly relaxed over the course of a week, when a laugh returned to a mouth that had forgotten how to shape it, when a regular arrived early for the first time in months and sat with their eyes closed a little longer than usual. They tended not only to the water, but to the space between people, the space that held meaning without words. Even their smallest gestures, a warm towel placed precisely, a quiet sweep of the corner where no one sat, carried a depth most visitors never fully grasped. But the bathhouse knew. It always knew. On some nights when the moon hung low and pale through the high windows, the steam took on a silvery hue. In these moments, the air itself felt thinner, almost reverent. You might catch the scent of something ancient, burnt cedar, wild thyme, something no longer used but not yet forgotten. Those were the nights when even the most casual visitor moved more slowly, as if not to disturb whatever passed through the mist. It was said that on such nights, the bathhouse listened more closely, remembered more deeply, and gave more generously. What it gave could not be held in the hand or told in a story. It could only be felt, quietly, weeks later, when you stepped into the cold air and found yourself breathing easier without knowing why. The bathhouse asked nothing in return for this gift, only that you come as you are, and that you leave with whatever you are meant to carry. And that, perhaps, was its greatest kindness. Visitors often remarked on how the bathhouse seemed larger on some days and smaller on others, though its walls had not changed in centuries. The structure was fixed, the stone unmoving, And yet those who returned regularly would swear that certain rooms felt wider when they were at peace, narrower when they carried grief. A bench that felt welcoming one evening might seem cold and distant the next. Some chalked it up to mood, to perception, to tricks played by light and steam, but others suspected the bathhouse responded, not just to the weather or the number of guests, but to the hearts of those within it. This wasn't seen as magic. It was simply how the place worked. It adapted, subtly, silently, offering what it could and withdrawing when it must. Even the echo of footsteps shifted with the day's mood. On quiet mornings, the sound was gentle, almost musical, bouncing softly from wall to wall. But on days when tension filled the town, after an argument in the marketplace, or when rumors swept through the streets, the same footsteps would sound sharper, as if the stone had grown harder. Those attuned to the space could sense this before even stepping inside. They'd pause at the threshold, breathe in the air, and know whether the bathhouse was in a giving mood or whether it needed to be left alone. On certain days, you might find only a few souls inside, scattered across the chambers like forgotten thoughts. These were the days when the bathhouse felt most intimate. Not empty, never empty, but quieter, more personal. A place not for gathering but for communion. You might share a pool with only one other person, both of you floating in silence, not speaking, not even looking, and yet deeply aware of each other's presence. It was a strange kind of companionship, wordless, weightless, and real. The steam blurred the lines between stranger and friend. Everyone became a silhouette, a breath, a ripple in the water. And sometimes, that was all the closeness you needed. The architecture itself seemed to guide emotion. The narrow passages encouraged introspection, while the wide pools invited openness. The vaulted ceilings drew your eyes upward, reminding you of scale, of age, of how small individual worries could become in such a space. There were patterns carved into the stone, geometric, floral, some worn to near invisibility, that regulars traced with their fingers like prayers. No one remembered who had carved them. No one needed to. Their presence was enough. They grounded the space, added texture to the memory that lived in the walls. The bathhouse did not speak, but it echoed, gently and precisely. If you arrived full of noise, it quieted you. If you arrived hollow, it filled you with warmth. If you arrived broken, it did not mend you, but it held your pieces together until you were strong enough to do so yourself. That was its promise. Not healing, not change, but holding. Holding space. Holding memory. Holding you. No matter how familiar one became with the bathhouse, there was always the feeling of discovering something new. A sound you hadn't noticed before. A scent that lingered just beyond memory. Or a tiny detail carved into a column you must have passed 100 times. Some of these things revealed themselves only to those who paid close attention, to those who moved slowly and listened deeply. Others seemed to emerge only when they chose to, as if the bathhouse decided when you were ready to notice. A thin line of moss between two stones, thriving where no sunlight touched. A single tile in the frigidarium that never matched the others, always cool to the touch even when the air was warm. A soft hum, low and steady, from beneath the floor in the hottest chamber, like the quiet breath of something asleep. These were not frightening discoveries. They were invitations, clues, reminders that the bathhouse was not simply a building, but a companion. It did not need to speak to be understood. Regulars often developed routines, not out of habit alone, but because these rituals became a kind of conversation with the space itself. Pouring water 3 times before entering the pool. Resting one hand on the archway before stepping into the steam. Sitting for exactly 7 breaths before rising to leave. These gestures were rarely taught. They arose naturally, as if whispered by the walls. Over time, they became part of you. You didn't question them. You followed them, and in doing so, you felt known. Even first-time visitors, if they were quiet enough, seemed to fall into rhythm with the space. They walked more slowly, spoke more gently. The bathhouse did not demand reverence. It inspired it. It offered comfort without condition, but also held boundaries, some of them unspoken, others gently enforced by the attendants. Those who shouted or disrupted the stillness were met with soft but firm glances, no punishment, just a quiet pressure to respect the peace or leave it be. And most did. Because once you felt the stillness of the bathhouse, once you understood what it protected, you wanted to preserve it. For yourself. For others. For whatever lived in the warmth and quiet, watching without judgment. There was an odd sense of continuity within its walls. Generations had come and gone, yet the air felt layered, as though every laugh and tear, every whispered confession and silent moment still floated somewhere within the steam. Some bathers believed that by entering the bathhouse, they joined a kind of lineage, not by blood, but by presence. That their footsteps fell in the same places as those long gone, and their sighs echoed alongside voices from centuries past. In this way, the bathhouse became more than just a building. It was a memory made of stone and water, alive with the breath of those who had come seeking peace. And as you moved through its chambers, whether for the first time or the 100th, you carried that memory with you, soft as steam, deep as heat, quiet as your own heartbeat beneath the surface. There was a small window high in the southern wall of the caldarium, nearly invisible from the floor, hidden behind years of soot and condensation. It was just a slit of stone and glass, and yet those who noticed it often found themselves staring upward without knowing why. During certain hours of the day, the sunlight would pierce through it in a narrow beam, cutting through the thick steam like a blade of fire. And when that happened, even the noisiest bathers grew quiet. Something about the way the light fell, direct, unyielding, perfectly still, reminded people of time passing. It didn't last long, maybe a few minutes, but during that time the entire room seemed to pause. Conversations softened, movements slowed. You could hear the water lapping gently against the walls, and your own breath echoed louder than expected. The window wasn't there for ventilation or decoration. Some believed it marked something ancient, an alignment with the sun on specific days, or a memory carved into the architecture by people long forgotten. Others thought it was a kind of eye, a reminder that even in this enclosed space of silence and shadow, the world outside still turned, still watched, still waited. A few of the oldest attendants performed a quiet ritual when the light appeared. They'd stand near the edge of the pool, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent rhythm. Not a prayer, perhaps, but something close. A gesture passed down from someone before them, its meaning lost but its purpose preserved. Regulars who came during that hour often brought small offerings, coins, herbs, folded pieces of parchment. These were left on the ledge beneath the window, and though no one ever took them away, they never remained for long. The next day, the ledge would be clean again, the stone warm from the sun, the air thick with the faint scent of something burnt and sweet. No one asked who removed the offerings. No one needed to. The bathhouse had its ways. Even those who didn't believe in anything beyond the heat and the steam felt the shift when the light appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, like an old friend slipping into the room unnoticed, and reminded you, gently, that you were part of something older and deeper than your thoughts. On cloudy days, when no light came through the window, the absence was felt. The caldarium seemed dimmer, heavier. People didn't linger. They moved on to the next room, as if the silence had grown too thick, but when the light returned, it was welcomed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for temples. And in that moment, bathed in heat and light and breath, you remembered that the bathhouse was not just a place to wash away the day. It was a place to remember who you were beneath all the layers you carried. A place to be still. A place to begin again, even if just for a little while. Every so often, a traveler would arrive at the bathhouse. Someone clearly not from the town, their clothing stitched differently, their gaze curious and cautious all at once. They'd pause just inside the entrance, taking in the thick air, the echo of dripping water, the slow movements of those already within. To the uninitiated, the bathhouse could feel overwhelming, a world unto itself, with rules written in silence and glances, and yet the space made room for them. Attendants would guide them gently, without words, showing them where to place their belongings, where to step first, how to move through the chambers without disrupting the rhythm. The other bathers rarely stared. They simply watched, noting how quickly or slowly the traveler adapted. Some adjusted immediately, drawn into the quiet like dust into sunlight. Others struggled, speaking too loudly, stepping too fast, as if trying to bend the place to their understanding. But eventually, most fell into step, their pace softening, their voices fading. There was something about the warmth, the repetition, the undemanding stillness that stripped away urgency. A few travelers returned again and again. Some stayed in the town far longer than they'd planned. Others left behind little signs of their presence. A carved symbol, pressed into damp clay and hidden beneath a bench. A poem etched faintly into the stone near the changing room. A necklace looped gently around a pipe in the hottest chamber. These small offerings were rarely noticed at first, but over time they became part of the place, absorbed like all else into the ever-growing memory of the bathhouse. The space did not judge newcomers. It welcomed them in the same way it welcomed the rain, without expectation, without effort. It gave them what it gave everyone: time, silence, warmth. And it watched what they did with it. Some found in the bathhouse a kind of peace they had not known they were seeking. Others found something more surprising: themselves, clearer and quieter than before. For those who truly listened, the bathhouse offered reflection not only in the surface of its pools, but in its structure, its rhythm, its age. It reminded you that you were one thread in a very long tapestry, that your breath joined the breath of those who came before and would come after. You became part of a lineage, not by blood, but by presence. That realization could be humbling, or comforting, often both. By the time the traveler became a regular, if they did, they moved like the others, slow, careful, aware. They knew the patterns of the lamps, the smell of the air, just before the fire was stoked. They knew when to speak and when to sit in stillness. And in learning these things, they changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways that lingered long after they stepped back into the world. That was what the bathhouse offered. No promises, no transformations, only space. Space to feel, to breathe, to become. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. There was one final space in the bathhouse that few spoke of, though nearly everyone had seen it. Just a small room tucked between two main chambers, with no obvious purpose and no official name. It contained no pool, no bench, no decoration. The walls were smooth and unadorned, the floor flat and slightly warmer than the rest of the building. A single oil lamp burned there at all times, set high in a niche where no hand could reach, its flame never flickering, never fading. Most bathers passed it by without entering, assuming it to be a storage area or a maintenance passage. But some paused, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Those who stepped inside rarely stayed long. They stood in silence, sometimes placing a hand against the wall, sometimes simply breathing in the stillness before stepping out again, changed in some small, immeasurable way. No one waited in that room. No one spoke there. It was as if the very air discouraged noise, invited stillness. Regulars who noticed it called it the breath chamber, not because it echoed, but because it seemed to listen. It was said that if you entered with a question in your heart and stood quietly enough, you might leave with something like an answer. Not in words, not even in thought, but in feeling. A soft knowing, a loosening, a shift. Whether this was true didn't matter. The room's presence was enough. Like everything else in the bathhouse, it asked nothing and gave only what it could. And as with all things here, the more you respected it, the more it seemed to give in return. This was the heart of the bathhouse's quiet power. It did not force change, it simply held space for it. In a world that demanded so much, speed, noise, explanation, the bathhouse offered the opposite. Slowness, silence, mystery. It welcomed everyone the same way, and it let them go just as gently. Some bathers came for a season and moved on. Others returned for years, aging alongside the stone. Some brought their children, teaching them the rituals not with words, but with actions. A hand steadied on the tile, a towel folded just so, a nod of thanks to the room before leaving it. In time, those children became adults, and the bathhouse watched them in turn. And so the cycle continued, as it always had. The fire beneath the floor never went out. The water flowed, the steam rose, the lamps were lit, and the echoes of footsteps faded into the hum of a place that knew how to keep secrets. A place that offered, in its own quiet way, a kind of sanctuary, not from the world, but within it. You never truly left the bathhouse. Even as you stepped back into the daylight, wrapped in dry cloth, heart a little lighter, mind a little quieter, You carried its stillness with you, in your breath, in your bones, in the pause before speaking, in the hush of a morning alone. It became part of you as you had become part of it. And somewhere, in the rhythm of dripping water and the warmth of old stone, the bathhouse remembered,